The back-to-back Stanley Cup finalists had a quieter offseason than people may have expected. And with the Connor McDavid extension looming over the team, time might be running out on the Oilers' championship window. This is the 2025-26 Deep Dive on the Edmonton Oilers. Hello and welcome to team number 6 on my 2025-26 NHL Deep Dive series. We're talking about the Edmonton Oilers, and like I said in the intro, the back-to-back Stanley Cup runner-ups are in a very curious spot because really, looking at this roster, it's not a world-beating roster. It just has arguably the two best players in the world on it. Now, it's a good team. I don't think the Oilers roster is horrid, but I do think that it having McDavid and Draisaitl have really masked a lot of the issues the Oilers have had over the last number of years in terms of their roster building. And clearly, I mean, we've seen what the best player in the world can do. I mean, I don't really have time for any sort of argument against Connor McDavid being the best player on the planet, because you just don't like the Oilers if that's your stance. But obviously, the contract situation is the biggest thing hanging over this team, and I want to begin by saying I haven't really done a ton of contract speculation in this series, but if I had to bet on the destination for McDavid by the middle of July, I guess I do think that he does re-sign in Edmonton. I just think it'll be a short-term deal. I think we're looking at a 3-4 year at the max deal for pretty close to max salary. The $16 million number that Kaprizov got sounds about right. Maybe it's more than that. But I do think it'll be a shorter term, 3 or 4 year deal to kind of give the Oilers an opportunity to see what happens. But I also think it depends on what this team looks like this year, right? I think if the Oilers lose in the first round, it's probably more likely that he leaves. If they can, push for a third straight Stanley Cup final, then maybe he decides that this team is close enough and he can try to win here. So the season has a lot riding on it in that sense, because clearly Connor McDavid wants to win, right? And I don't think you can look at the runs that he's had here and make a case that he hasn't been one of the best players in the playoffs, if not the best player in the playoffs, right? I was a strong proponent of him winning the Conn Smythe the year they lost to Vegas in the Western Conference Final. And I was obviously a huge advocate for him winning it 2 years ago when he did. And I think that there's a case to be made that he could have won it last year too. Obviously, I think that the Sam Bennett pick was probably the right one. But I do think that there was a case to be made for Connor McDavid that year as well. So there really isn't. It's hard for me to look at the Oilers right now and say that they're going to be fine if McDavid leaves, right? I think that there's some teams in this top area right now where if their best player were to leave, I still think the team would be fine. Maybe not as high as up as they are, but let me put it in perspective for you. If Mikko Rantanen left the Dallas Stars right now, if he didn't re-sign, and they lost him for nothing in the offseason, right? I think Mikko Rantanen is arguably the best player on the Stars. But we can do this with any of their players. I still think Dallas is a top 6 team in the league, right? They were the previous season, right, without Mikko Rantanen, right? Going into last season, they were still up there. And Mikko Rantanen's one of the 10 best forwards in the league. So that's my point, right? But if Connor McDavid leaves Edmonton, this team is in a dire situation because I don't know if this roster outside of these two players that are featured on the screen right now is a championship contender level roster. Whereas a team like Dallas, for instance, if they had lost, and I'm just picking on Dallas specifically, but if they hadn't re-signed Mikko Rantanen, I don't think that really it hurts them obviously, but I don't think it's this massive loss that is detrimental to their contender hopes. And I do think for the Oilers, if Connor McDavid decides that this is his final year in Edmonton, I think the Oilers championship window just kind of slams shut. And that's what makes the season so vital for this team. Now, I don't think they have to win the Stanley Cup this year, but I definitely think they need to be in contention. They need to be the Western Conference Final team for for this to be taken seriously as a location where McDavid can win. And that kind of jumps us into the roster here. I mean, you look at this team and third in offense. Again, that's primary carried by 2 players. Seventh in defense. I do like their blue line. I think that it's solid enough. Goaltending is obviously the biggest question mark. They're 24th, but I think as I talked about we haven't seen a team really in the 20s here for a little bit, but most of the teams in that range are more or less like very comparable. Like I think from like 5th, 26th to like 18th, 17th. The teams in that range are very close in terms of what they have. It's kind of grasping at straws to rank them. I don't think that so for instance, like the 24th goaltending tandem, I don't think is bad. I just think that like it's very hit or miss is kind of the point. So just to kind of give some context there. Special teams, they're 6th. Obviously the power play is unbelievable. The penalty kill is fine. And coaching culture, I have them at 11th. Again, that's mostly carried by the fact that this is a championship team, as long as they have Connor McDavid on their roster. And I think that, from a coaching perspective, the team is good. I don't think they're great. Management is questionable. I don't love what Stan Bowman's done so far. But I don't absolutely hate it either. I don't think he's done anything insane, but I don't think that he's done a great job elevating this roster. And I don't think Ken Holland did either. So it's that's kind of the way it is with that team at this point. We jump into the management team. Like I said, Stan Bowman C+. He hasn't been here for that long, so it's hard to give him a higher rating than that because he hasn't really put his full stamp on this roster yet. Head coach Chris Knobloch, I think is a little overrated in terms of what he's been able to do. Obviously, he's gone to the back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals, but I really think that this team would have been they would have course corrected under the Jay Woodcroft regime, because the start of the season where Woodcroft got fired, this team was they had the worst shooting percentage in the NHL at that point, and I really think that just would have course corrected itself. I mean, it did eventually. Chris Knobloch didn't change a ton about their system. They just started finishing their chances at a more consistent rate. So I think that Knobloch's been fine. I think he's been good. That's why he's a B+. But I do think that Jay Woodcroft is also was a good coach and wasn't the issue necessarily. But and same with goaltending, right? If you get consistent goaltending, that it does a lot for you, right? I have them in the contender category. This is the first team in that contender group. And again, back-to-back Stanley Cup Finals. You got Connor McDavid. You have Leon Draisaitl. It's great, right? The question that I have with this team, right, and this is kind of a question for Oilers fans. I want you to sound off in the comments. If we get to the trade deadline, right, the Oilers are sitting. I mean, I have them currently as the second best team in the Pacific Division. Let's say they're second in the Pacific Division. Connor McDavid hasn't. His comments about re-signing are consistent with what they've been now, and you have the Dallases of the world look like they're going to win the West. Vegas looks really good. How much are you entertaining a Connor McDavid trade at that point? Do you run it back and if his comments are still, I want to see if this team can win a Stanley Cup before I re-sign? Right, how confident are you that this team gets to the Western Conference Final? Let's say that's the line, right? You have to beat Vegas, and you have to beat whoever the third place team is in the Pacific. Take your pick of the 4 that might be in contention for that spot. How much are you contemplating a Connor McDavid trade, with the possibility that the possibility of him leaving being 35-40%? It's an interesting question, and it's a conversation that if the Oilers aren't having that behind closed doors right now, they're doing a disservice to themselves. So I think that's just an interesting thing. Again, I think the most likely outcome here is that he does re-sign on a short-term deal, but I also don't think that really happens until after the season. I'd be surprised if it happened during the year. So that that I think that's a conversation that needs to be had in these meetings, and hopefully it is, because there'd be 31 teams that would offer up a pretty nice package for the best player in the world. So it's an interesting situation to be in here if you're the Edmonton Oilers, and I'm curious to see how it kind of plays out with this team as we move forward. But just something to think about. And is Stan Bowman the guy you want pulling the trigger on that trade if that potentially happens? We jump into what this team looked like last year, and I mean, obviously they were very good. Their numbers actually aren't like extremely, like, it looks like a team that might have some positive regression this year. I mean, their goals for, they were 14th. They were third in expected goals for. The evolving hockey model has them about the same spot. Same with their goals against. It was 22nd. Their expected goals against on JFresh was 10th. Evolving hockey does not have them there. They're in the kind of the mid-teens in that sense, but still some possible positive regression there. I mean, goal share being 18th, their expected goal share being 4th. You can tell that there's definitely some regular season positive regression that can happen here. And the Oilers didn't have a great regular season, right? They finished third in the Pacific. It was a little bit of an underwhelming, rocky regular season for them. Very similar to what Florida went through, honestly. Although I think Florida's was a lot more calculated than Edmonton's was. They both kind of had, quote unquote, disappointing regular seasons. And then obviously they both had the success there. I mean, at the end of the day, the regular season isn't going to be, a concern. Like, barring an injury, the Oilers are going to be a playoff team. I think that of the teams in my top 6 at this point, I'm extremely confident to say that about them. There's maybe one team in this top 5 that I might not be as confident about saying that with. We'll talk about them soon. But in terms of barring an injury to Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl, and even if that does happen, barring a long injury or season-ending injury to one of those two guys, the Oilers should be a playoff team. I mean, compared to how bad the Pacific is, and then just the top-end talent on this team, I'm not really worried about their regular season numbers as much as I am for some of these other teams, right? Like, I think that there's more legitimate concerns to have about regular season success with even some of the teams in the top 5. I don't think that's really the case with Edmonton, right? At the end of the day, Edmonton's season is going to be won or lost in the postseason and what they can do trying to get to another Stanley Cup final and winning the Stanley Cup, right? Like, that's the goal for this team. Nothing else really matters. It's very much what we talked about with Toronto and what we kind of talked about with Winnipeg, where, yes, obviously the teams from here on out, the goal is to win the Stanley Cup, but I think that there is, there's more runway with some of the teams that we talk about here, right? Like, I don't think if Florida doesn't win a Stanley Cup this year, the fan base is going to riot, right? Like, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think if Tampa Bay doesn't win the Stanley Cup this year, I don't think the fan base is really going to riot. Even Vegas, right? Like, I think, Vegas has this pretty decent runway now, with the Mitch Marner era starting, where I don't think it's really like a winner, everything sucked season. Whereas for Edmonton, I really kind of think that's the case. And I don't think they have to win or there's riots, but I think they have to be within striking distance of a Stanley Cup again. Because if you're not, then, that 35% chance that I give McDavid of leaving skyrockets past 50. So again, like, the regular season isn't going to matter really in the grand scheme of things, but it's going to be about what this team can do in the postseason. And this year is maybe the most important season in the last 20 years for the Edmonton Oilers, at least, because of that. And I think that's a real, I don't think that's an over exaggeration. I think that this might be the most important season they've had since Wayne Gretzky was an Edmonton Oiler, because there's such a real possibility that 97 isn't on the team a year from now, and you have to succeed this season. And I don't think that's much of an over exaggeration for this team. So speaking of this forward core, let's talk about it, because I think it's a really interesting group. Obviously led by Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, both of which are two of the best players in the NHL. I hopefully I don't get a ton of pushback on that. Obviously I don't have Leon Draisaitl at number 2 on that list, but 94 overall, he's still in the conversation for being one of the best players in the world. I get that there's some scrutiny about his numbers when he's not playing with Connor McDavid and whatever. Like, I think if you're gonna nitpick and tell me that Leon Draisaitl isn't a our Hart Trophy level player because he plays with Connor McDavid every once in a while, I think you're kind of insane. Like, you just need to watch. Like, besides the numbers, you just have to watch Leon Draisaitl's skill set, and you can see that he is clearly he can be the best player on a Stanley Cup winning team. I think that team needs to be better than a team with Connor McDavid being your best player on it would need to be. But I don't think that there's any player really in the NHL that could carry a team in the way that Connor McDavid could. So that's besides the point. Zach Hyman is a super underrated player in my mind. He has a insane skill set, and that contract is starting to age better than I thought it would when he signed that deal. Now, are we concerned about injuries a little bit? Obviously had the injury in the playoffs, which I do think actually really hurt this team, and wasn't discussed as much as I thought it would be. I think the narrative around Connor McDavid kind of took the center stage in that. But Zach Hyman is a very good player. I do like the acquisition of Andrew Mangiapane. I think that he has, I don't want to say like taken a step. Well, he's taken a step down from where he was like in his peak in Calgary. But I do think that he can still be a super useful player in this top six. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, I think, is a little overrated for what he is. He's very much a power play point specialist, but he can still have some value 5-on-5, but I don't think that his value is. I think it's a little bit overstated to what this team can do. Aside from that, like I think there's been some questionable moves in this bottom six. Really, like I think you look at somebody like Matt Savoie and Isaac Howard, and the importance those two are going to have. But Trent Frederick doesn't really move the needle for me. Adam Henrique doesn't really move the needle for me. Matisse Gammark had a nice playoffs, but not somebody I'm super excited about. Kasperi Kapanen, same thing. I think his peak might be over now, so it's very much like an underwhelming bottom six that I think is in some cases tied up to some very albatross contracts that people can talk all they want about Connor McDavid taking a pay cut to help them win championships, but so a team that was paying Evander Kane a ton of money, it's a team that signed Darnell Nurse to a $9 million contract, that didn't Connor McDavid's money had nothing to do with the money that Darnell Nurse is getting paid. So I think that if he really wants to win, he should take a discount narrative is kind of dumb when the Oilers have a track record of not spending extra cap space particularly wisely. And I think the bottom six on this team is a good indication of that, right? You're really relying on Matt Savoie and Isaac Howard both to supply some much needed secondary scoring on this team because, again, besides Draisaitl and McDavid, who, again, are two of the best offensive players in the NHL, there isn't really a ton of scoring on this team, right? But you have these guys who are, contributing to 40+% of the team's points each, really, really carrying the load there and really helping cover up some of the blemishes on this offense that I think desperately needs some much needed secondary scoring help. We start with Connor McDavid, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Connor McDavid. He's the best player in the world. He's a franchise-changing player who is on the last year of his contract and is the biggest question mark in the NHL. Selfishly, as a fan who loves chaos, I think him hitting the market is the most fun option. And that might happen anyway, especially if he's not interested in signing an 8-year deal. There's really no point for him not to hit the market and see what's out there, right? That doesn't mean he's not going to re-sign in Edmonton, but there's no advantage to re-signing in Edmonton before July 1st if you don't want an 8-year deal anyway. And considering how much the salary cap's supposed to go up, him signing an 8-year deal makes zero financial sense, right? Like a 3-year deal makes the most sense for him, right? 3-4-year deal makes the most sense just because the cap going up, then you can hit that number, you can hit that max pay slot again, right? It's very much how the NBA is a bunch of 2-year deals because players just want to continuously get the max salary. So it makes sense in that case. So realistically, there's no reason for him to sign pre-July 1st with the Oilers, unless he for some reason wants an 8-year deal and just doesn't want to talk with us again, which I don't think is likely, even if he does want to sign in Edmonton. But that's besides the point. Connor McDavid is the best player in the world. Argue with a wall if you disagree. I think it's very clear that he's the best player in the world. I don't really care about he had a couple poor games in the Stanley Cup playoffs last year, and he was basically single-handedly the reason why the Oilers came back from 3-0 the year before. So, I don't want to hear the he doesn't perform in the Stanley Cup final because the Oilers would have been swept if Connor McDavid didn't exist 2 years ago. So whatever. His defense I think is completely underrated. He's actually turned into a pretty decent defender, but the offense is he's the best offensive player in the league. He's one of the most creative offensive players in the league. He's one of the best power play specialists in the league. His finishing is phenomenal. He could win the Rocket any year if he chose to, which he did a couple years ago. He just kind of decided he was going to score a bunch of goals and won the Rocket. He had a 150-point season a couple years ago. He's the best player in the world. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on what Connor McDavid does well. Like, I don't think we really have to talk about the nuances of the best player in the planet's game. But there you go. Shout out to Connor McDavid. He could he could literally go to the San Jose Sharks in the summer, and they would instantly become a Stanley Cup contender because Connor McDavid is that good. He has the LeBron James ability that, like, LeBron in his prime, especially when he left to go to Miami and then left Miami to go back to Cleveland, had this innate ability to just turn any team in the league that he would have went to would instantly become at least a fringe contender at worst. And I really think that there isn't a team in the NHL right now that if Connor McDavid didn't go on to, wouldn't at least be in the conversation for a Stanley Cup. Like, they'd have top 6-7 odds in the league. Like, if you went to the Seattle Kraken this year right now, and you just plopped Connor McDavid onto the Kraken team, who I think are the most like no man's land franchise in the NHL, they instantly become at least a fringe contender for the Cup. And I don't think there's another player in the league that can do that. So again, that's another reason why I think Connor McDavid hitting the market is so interesting, because like, if he wants to win, he kind of has his pick of the entire NHL. The story's kind of the same with Leon Draisaitl, just to like a slightly lesser extent. His defense hasn't been. It's similar in terms of his defensive output. It's not great, but it's decent. His offense, again, one of the best creators in the league. I think his playmaking is phenomenal. Different styles, obviously. Leon Draisaitl is the elite passer. He can score obviously at a high rate too. Power play numbers are fantastic. Again, one of the best players in the NHL. A fantastic piece. There's really no negatives about him. I get like some people like his numbers without Connor McDavid decline, but like this is a player who's used to playing with Connor McDavid too. Obviously he doesn't have the best player in the world trait of just being able to play with any player in the league, right? Like I think like you could tell, like, even in the prime like Penguins days, right? Like they structured who they're going to have on their team more around Malkin than they did Crosby, because Malkin didn't have the ability to play with literally every single player in the league and make them very good like Sidney Crosby did. So like I get it, right? It's fun to be like, oh look, Draisaitl's numbers get worse when he's not playing with Connor McDavid. It's like, yeah, well, so would every player in the league. Like, sorry. So I don't really buy that. Leon Draisaitl rocks. I'm not here to pick, like, I'm not going to make a list of the top 10 players in the league, but Leon Draisaitl will be on it. We can nitpick where on that list he falls, but like there's really no point in discussing him not being a top player in the NHL. Now's where things get interesting, right? Because we start talking about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and like I said, I think that Ryan Nugent-Hopkins gets a lot of unnecessary praise. Like, he gets a lot of unwarranted praise. I think Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is a fine player, but there are legitimate issues with his game that I just don't think get talked about enough, because he puts up a ton of points, and that's all people really care about, because he's like the fourth most important forward on the team. And like, hey, right, you have Evan Bouchard, who's also an offensive producer. Hopkins can kind of hide in the shadows and like kind of avoid criticism, but he's really not like a fantastic play driver. Like, he's very much just somebody who can accumulate points at a decent rate, which there is something to be said about having that skill. But like, I don't know if you plop Hopkins on another team that even gets close to the same kind of production, right? He just kind of knows how to play with the players that he is, and he puts up a ton of points on the power play, which, like, fair enough. So I really think that, like, if the Oilers if they wanted to be like super aggressive here and try to like turn the tide here, and if a McDavid move does happen and he does leave, I really think that moving Ryan Nugent-Hopkins before that next season would be a ideal thing to do, because one, his value will be fairly high, because there's a lot of GMs that will literally just look at his point totals and be like, oh, he looks pretty good, and he's got the name value, right? Like, he was a high pick, whatever, and he's a high pick that's putting up a ton of points, playing a high role, been to the Stanley Cup final a couple times. People will buy into that, but I really don't think that, like, in a different system, away from McDavid and Draisaitl, that Hopkins is nearly the same player. He isn't showing the play driving ability. He isn't showing the creativity. He isn't generating a ton of chances on his own. He's very much been relying on those chances being developed for him, and he's capitalized on them, and good for him for doing that. But I think that's a legitimate issue here, and I think that does kind of help weigh down what the cap on this team is, because when you have a bunch of players who are just reliant on being fed through your two best players, it leads to a very much a dependency on those two players to help you win games. And it's hard to get out of that. Very few teams have actually figured out a way to successfully like have other players who can sustain themselves. I think that the 2010 Chicago team and the 13 Chicago team, even to a higher extent, were very, very good at that because you had Taves and Kane, but you also had guys like Patrick Sharp who were very good at creating their own offense. I mean, Marian Hossa was a Hall of Fame player, before he went to Chicago. They had this depth. Even guys like Bufflin and Ladd, deeper down the lineup in 2010, were able to do that. And obviously, we saw what both those players turned into. They were both very effective, high end players. Whereas like on the Oilers, like I look around their middle six and like Zach Hyman's really good. But even then, like Zach Hyman's never played with a non, top 10 player really in his career because he had Austin Matthews in Toronto and then he had, McDavid and Draisaitl here in Edmonton. So like I don't look at Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and think, yeah, if he's walked to, if he was placed on, Seattle, he's not being the primary offensive guy on that team. And I think that he's looked at as, a great secondary scorer right now. And I really don't think that's what he is. He obviously fits in what Edmonton is, but there's very much a dependency on those top two guys. And I think that that's one of the pitfalls of this team in their team building in general, is that it's far too reliant on McDavid and Draisaitl being McDavid and Draisaitl. We talk about Zach Hyman, and Zach Hyman's kind of a different story because, like, his underlying numbers point to a player who wouldn't have that same issue. Now, I don't think that if you move Zach Hyman to a middling team that he's suddenly massively elevates their ceiling. I think that his numbers would decline just because higher usage rate, a higher work rate will naturally do that to a player. But I don't think that he's as reliant on, being carried by one of the top two guys on this roster. And I think that's what gives him a lot of dynamic, value to this team. And we saw, when Corey Perry had to step up and play on that top line after the Hyman injury, it did lose some of its spark, right? Like Corey Perry was able to fill in about as well as you could expect Corey Perry to, but like Corey Perry isn't Zach Hyman, and Hyman's somebody who can drive play by himself. He can generate a lot of his own opportunities. He can finish at a higher rate. His defensive ability is actually pretty good. He's a decent, quote unquote power forward. Although I don't know if I'd necessarily classify him as that, but he's somebody who is 33 going on 34, who hasn't looked like a 34-year-old. There's been some guys in this series that I'm looking at their numbers and you can clearly see a decline. And now I think Zach Hyman has taken a bit of a step back from where he was, maybe when he left Toronto. But I think that this contract is aging a lot better than I thought it would. And I have to give the Oilers credit for seeing that and bringing him in, because I think that he's actually turned out to be a very good number 3 on this team and has again helped mask some of the deficiencies with a player like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Andrew Mangiapane was signed, and Andrew Mangiapane had a pretty rough season last year. But I can see the vision here, right? I can see the low-risk move, bringing in a guy like this who has had very good success being one of those underrated, analytic darling, middle six guys who, if given the right opportunity, can produce again, right? I think that the potential is actually higher to get more out of him than it would be to get out of like Evander Kane, for instance, especially for the money. The surplus value there, again, Evander Kane might end up with more points, but the surplus value for how much you're paying him, I think Mangiapane might actually be a better bet. So if that's just what you're looking for here, that's good for me. I think that wanting to get prime Mangiapane from what he was in Calgary out of him now is a little bit too much to ask for. But I can see a world in which it could happen, right? Like there is a possibility that he does end up turning into a decent player for this team. So I think that there's potential here for him to be a good, top 6 forward. But again, like we talk about the lack of scoring on this team, and like if Andrew Mangiapane is like required to be a good second liner for this team in order for them to have a successful season, I think you're asking a lot, right? Like you compare this to the Florida Panthers roster, where it's like Andrew Mangiapane would be on like he'd be their 9th best forward, right? Like they'd bring him in as like a surplus ad to like replace what Mason Marchment was. Like I just or not Mason. I'm losing my mind. Thinking Dallas, but same thing. You think fine? Let's compare. Let's do Dallas then. If I brought up Mason Marchment, right? Like that's not a significant loss to the team, right? Where it's like you have a guy who's your eighth, ninth best forward that you're just replacing on your third line. Whereas like in Edmonton, I feel like Mangiapane's role is going to be like you're going to be a top six forward. If you can't do that, then it's a letdown basically, which is like insane to think about for this team. And I think you look at somebody like what Mason Marchment was in Dallas, and that's kind of the comparison there. Even like a Carter Verhaeghe, who I think is very good, but is nowhere near like the fifth most important player on his team. And I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure, I think, on Mangiapane to succeed as a top six forward, because they really don't have, like, unless it's Savoie or Howard, which it could be. I think you're asking a lot from those young kids to step up into a top six role and suddenly become a top six forward on a Stanley Cup contending team. And I think that's a lot to ask for Mangiapane too. I think Mangiapane I'd feel a lot more comfortable with on a third line, being kind of an underrated like sleeper agent, basically, who can just come out and kill you in any random game. And I think that's where an Andrew Mangiapane would get the most value for this team. And I don't know if he's going to be given that kind of opportunity. Vasek Podkolzin is in a similar boat, right? I think Podkolzin had a decent season last year, actually. He looked pretty solid for what he was asked to do, and he's still super young, right? He's 24 going on 25. There's still a ton of his prime left there. As a play driver, he is solid. He's good enough in that sense, but his value really comes from his defense. He's a very, very solid defender, and I think that's where you're going to get a ton of his value from here. And he does add like a nice wrinkle to the top six here in Edmonton, which is where he's likely going to be playing again. He seemed to find a nice home there last season. I don't think that'll change much, but his elite defensive ability in the top six, being able to play second line minute type games, top 6 minutes, be an elite defender, is something that the top six is kind of missing with the Oilers, and it's something that their bottom six doesn't have in abundance either. But Podkolzin's a very much needed defender and energy kind of player who does still have some offensive upside as well. So I like Podkolzin for what he's being asked to do here. But again, like, I don't know how much like dynamic play you're going to get out of Podkolzin, and I think that like when you're trying to be a Stanley Cup contender, you really need those players who can pop on both ends of the ice, right? Like maybe you take a bit of his defensive ability away, but you add it on to like, creativity on offense, and either way you're still going to get a similar value out of him overall, but it's a different skill set, and that different skill set, a different mix of type of player is what I think the Oilers desperately need, because their secondary scoring just is kind of non-existent on this roster, and Podkolzin doesn't spark me with a ton of excitement about his secondary scoring, although I do really like him as a player. Trent Frederic is like, he got the big contract. He's 28 years old. He's a fine bottom six forward, but this is what I mean. Like, it really does seem like the Oilers are investing in the wrong types of players, and they're being saved. Like their team building model is being resurrected and saved by Connor McDavid. And Trent Frederic is kind of like the perfect example of that. He's a fine bottom six forward, but he really doesn't inspire much in me. Like, I don't look at Trent Frederic and be like, yeah, that's a guy who's going to like change the course of this team. Whereas like, but like you compare it to some of the best teams in the league, right? Like the Tampa Bay Lightning went out and got Blake Coleman at the deadline, and Blake Coleman like fundamentally changed how that team was playing, right? Like he added a much needed like spark of energy into the bottom six, right? Like Brad Marchand could have won the goddamn Conn Smythe last year, and he was brought in at the deadline to be a third liner for them, right? Like, Trent Frederic doesn't spark that in me, and they paid, like, the deadline acquisition is fine, like, I don't care about that, but like then they re-sign him, and it's like I didn't love it, because it's not the inspired move that a team in 2025 who's trying to be serious about winning a Stanley Cup does. And again, like, a lot of these issues are being masked by the fact that they have two of the best players in the world playing ahead of them. But like, imagine if the Oilers had those two best players, but then they were able to build a bottom six like what Tampa or Florida had, right? And I don't want to hear about the salary, about the tax-free nonsense, because none of that matters, right? You're paying Trent Frederick an albatross amount of money. You're paying Darnell Nurse $9 million. Don't tell me that the reason why you can't add depth is because the tax. Like that's ridiculous. Like you didn't have to pay Darnell Nurse $9 million. Like let's be serious here. Like let's have a real grown-up conversation, right? Zach Hyman decided to sign with you. You have the ultimate bargaining chip and being able to play with Connor McDavid, right? Like I don't want to, like, don't give me the taxes or the advantage here, because Seattle has no tax too, and they've handed out worse contracts than any other team in the league basically the last 2 years. So like, come on, let's be real. Trent Frederick isn't somebody I would have spent money on to try to be serious about winning a Stanley Cup. He just wouldn't have been. There's nothing in his game that inspires me to think like this is the guy who's going to change the team. You know, we've talked about the two young guys here, Matt Savoie and Isaac Howard, and I think I'm lower on Isaac Howard than a lot of people are coming out of here. I think that he was the big name when he was drafted, and he really hasn't shown a ton since then. He hasn't had, these crazy seasons. In college, he hasn't been a defining player in that sense. Matt Savoie is somebody I'm a bit higher on. I really liked him out of the draft. He was somebody I was able to see play live a couple times, just being in Winnipeg at that point in my life. So I do think that there's a bit more hope for what Matt Savoie can be. But again, these are two players who are 20 and 21. They're not 18-year-olds stepping onto this team, which is going to be, it's going to mean that they're going to be asked to do a little bit more than an 18-year-old would be. And again, they're stepping onto a team that is trying to win a Stanley Cup, right? Like they're not stepping onto a middling team, right? They're not coming into like even a playoff team like in Ottawa or something, right? They're coming into a legitimate contender. This is like a win or go home season for them. It's a lot of pressure to ask for two guys who weren't even in your system a couple of years ago. So and haven't really had an opportunity in the NHL like at all. So like I worry that, yes, could both these players add that much needed secondary scoring this team needs? Yes, they could. But it's such a risky investment to make that this is the answer in a season where you have to win, or else the arguably second best player in the history of your franchise is going to walk. Right? Okay, maybe not second best, second most important player in the history of your franchise is going to walk. Is that better for the Mark Messier fans out there? It's a very, very risky bet to make. And I don't know if the Oilers have enough bargaining power to go out and get like a significant game changer to like fix this bottom 9 on this roster. I don't know if they have the willingness to do that, because like you don't want to go all in and then fail, and then McDavid leaves anyway and you're stuck with even less, right? Like that's even a riskier endeavor. So it's tough for me to look at this team and be like, outside of the two best players in the world, or two of the best players in the world, I really have a lot of questions about where the scoring is going to come from and where the offense is going to come from on this team. And we saw that like Florida was able to shut down McDavid in the Stanley Cup final this year, and the Oilers offense went dormant and they lost. They got very soundly beat in the Stanley Cup final, right? Like we saw this with in the Tampa Bay Florida series. And I'm talking about Florida a lot because it's the team that the Oilers have lost to, right? They've lost their last game of the season to the Florida Panthers 2 years in a row. We looked at the Tampa series. Like Tampa was able to shut down the Panthers, top 6 very effectively, and just got beat everywhere else. And it's I have concerns about where that extra scoring is going to come from. And maybe it does come from these two guys. But that's a very, very risky bet. Like you have to have a lot of faith that these are the two guys who are going to help you get there. If like you're risking your franchise on that. And that's a very, very bold move to make. I think there was guys to go after who would have been cheap, who would have been better options in the bottom six, right? Like, I think you don't sign Trent Frederick and you use that money to go get a couple guys that can help fill at the bottom of this roster, right? I think that that's just one example of it. But, and again, like, I don't think Trent Frederick's a bad player, but I think that there's options there, right? Like, you moved out Evander Kane, and you did re-sign Evan Bouchard, but like, I just think there was better players to go after in the depths of free agency that would have been safer moves. And then you can also have Savon Howard be there, but you have a bit of security around them, and they just kind of don't at this point. We talk about this blue line, and again, I think it's a good blue line. I have less questions about the blue line than I do about the offense. I actually think it's a pretty solid blue line. I think Ty Emerson is kind of the big question mark there. It's the sixth defenseman, but the rest of this blue line is very good, and there's options you can replace that with for pretty cheaply. You can very much go get a third pair defenseman at the deadline if you need to. So, like, I'm not going to stress out about that. But everybody else in this blue line, like Evan Bouchard, I think is insanely underappreciated for what he is as an offensive defenseman. One of the best in the NHL for sure, especially his playoff numbers are phenomenal. Matthias Ekholm has been one of the best two-way defenders in the NHL the last couple of years, aging perfectly. There's really no massive concerns I have there. Darnell Nurse is massively overpaid, but I think is actually like a decent defenseman. I think he gets, he's very much overpaid for what he is, but I don't think he's bad in any sense of the world. Jake Wallman, I think, was a good acquisition again. Very similar in terms of his like overall value to a Darnell Nurse. And then Brett Kulak, who I think again is an underrated third pair type defenseman here, and I think is very good in that role. So like it's a good blue line. I don't have a lot of concerns about the blue line, which is good for the Oilers because there's a big goalie shaped question mark on this roster, and there's a lot of questions about the depth on this team, but I think the blue line is actually pretty good. So this is going to be the positive side of this video. I begin with Evan Bouchard, who again, like, offensively is one of the best offensive defensemen in the NHL. He just re-signed to a massive contract because of it. I think it's definitely deserved for the money. I think that he wasn't, it's not a good contract in terms of like surplus value, but I think it's a fair one based on what he can bring to this team, especially with, heading into his prime right now. One of the best power play quarterbacks in the league. He's been given a perfect opportunity to play on, one of the best groups of, clusters of players on the power play. So that helps him for sure. Finishing, fantastic, especially for a defenseman. He's one of the best scoring defensemen in the NHL. Very, very creative guy. Excellent transition. Able to get the puck up to your best players. And when you have McDavid and Draisaitl to give the puck to, it makes your life a lot easier too. Very good at drawing penalties. Defensively, I think he might be undervalued in terms of what he can do defensively. He's pretty middle of the pack in terms of his defensive output, which league average player in that sense is fine enough when your offense is so overwhelmingly good. So I do think there's a lot to like here about Evan Bouchard. I think as the number one defenseman on this team, it's very much good enough on a Stanley Cup contending team. And the good news for him is he also plays with Matthias Ekholm, who is a fantastic number two. I think that Ekholm's offense isn't anything to it's good, but I don't think it's anything like insane, but it doesn't have to be because he's got Evan Bouchard beside him. And I think as a defender, Matthias Ekholm is so undervalued in terms of what he can bring defensively. I think that he's the two Stanley Cup finals runs have actually helped boost his stock up quite a bit as a defender. And, I think that, you're talking about a guy who's 35 years old and still putting up, very, very solid defensive numbers. And again, it's very much an IQ thing. We've talked about this with good defensive defensemen a lot in this series. So if you've been kind of following, I'm going to sound like a bit of a broken record here, but especially the older defensemen with high hockey IQ like Matthias Ekholm has are very, very good at, maintaining positioning, getting into lanes, and being able to, especially in their own zone, be able to counteract the lack of speed and like the lost step, right? I think that Matthias Ekholm is a good example of that, where he's very much a defender who can, make up for those lost steps and come through in a big way for the team. And so I think that that's a big strength of what Matthias Ekholm can do. And he pairs really well with what Evan Bouchard does. He's a very good number 2. Again, the age isn't necessarily a concern for his play this year, but it's just kind of a, like, is there a long-term solution for who the number 2 is going to be on this team after he leaves? I think that's a discussion that Connor McDavid's having with his agent right now is, okay, like, Matthias Ekholm's really good, but, like, is Jake Wallman going to be the guy to replace him? Right? Is Darnell Nurse going to suddenly appear and be a $9 million defenseman? I don't know, right? I think that's a legitimate conversation that Connor McDavid's having looking at this roster, right? Where it's like, it looks really good. The blue line looks really good today, but how does it look 2 years from now, right? When Connor McDavid's still in the prime of his career trying to win a Stanley Cup? It's a question that needs to be asked, and I think that's kind of my biggest concern, because I really like Matthias Ekholm, but 35 going on 36-year-old defenseman being your number 2 guy is a risky proposition to make. Jake Wallman had a solid season in San Jose. I think for what he was asked to do, he was very much placed in a higher role than he probably would have been comfortable with. I think I would have liked to see him in a bit of a lesser role, but again, like, it was San Jose and their blue line was a mess. But he was able to kind of, like, weather the storm as, you know, the Sharks' quote-unquote best defenseman last year. And I think that, you know, playing in a lesser role in Edmonton did really help his numbers. He had a much stronger stint at the end of that run in Edmonton, and I mean, you look at his numbers in Detroit when he was playing as, you know, a second pair guy, obviously behind Mort Seider. His numbers were also very good in that sense. So I think that just the number 1 role was what kind of weighed him down in San Jose, playing for an awful team. It wasn't a good mix of things for him. So clearly not a number 1 guy, but as you know, the 3rd best defenseman on this team, I think that he fits that role really well. And I do like Jake Wallman. I think that he was a very good acquisition for the Oilers, and really helps solidify this blue line, at least, you know, in the short term, with the concerns about Ekholm. But you know, in the short term, at least, I do think that it was a really good addition, and I'm excited to see what he looks like, you know, in a full stint here with the Oilers. Darnell Nurse, like I said, like, the contract is crazy. $9.3 million for another 5 years is a lot of money to be paying for a guy who's going to be 30, and not particularly exceptional. Offensively, Darnell Nurse is actually really solid. But, you know, the bad news for the Oilers is they have a number 1 guy as an offensive defenseman in Evan Bouchard, who's better. And if Darnell Nurse was a better 2-way defender, even like he was, you know, in 22-23, I think he was a pretty solid 2-way defender at that point. Still not worth $9 million, but hey, that's the world we live in. I think that, you know, his value gets undervalued, like, he gets underrated because of the contract is just so bad. It's very much the Seth Jones in Chicago years, where, like, I think Seth Jones was a fine second pair defenseman. He just wasn't worth $9 million. And I think Darnell Nurse is very much in the same boat, where he's a good second pair defenseman. He's just not worth first pair money. And that's, you know, where we start to discuss the optics about it, right? I think we're going to get to a world where Darnell Nurse is actually, like, underrated as a player, but his contract is so bad that it's also one of the worst in the league, and both those things can be true. You know, and even if, like, let's say this is Matthias Ekholm's last year, right? Like, it's possible. If Darnell Nurse is the guy who needs to step up and be that number 2 defenseman, like, he'll be 30 at the end of the season. There isn't a lot of runway there either. And, you know, when you have $9 million tied up in a guy like that, you know, until he's 35, it's a big commitment, and it's a big question mark on this team. And it's one of the things that I think would be, you know, if I'm Connor McDavid, it's something that I'm considering, where it's like, this blue line looks good now, right? But it's kind of an illusion, because it'll be good this year, but is it going to be good next year? Does Matthias Ekholm leave, right? Like, who's the guy who fills that spot? You're paying Darnell Nurse to do it, but he's going to be 30, and he's declined, you know, the last couple of years. So it's a very, very tedious situation, right? It's very much like teetering on the top of a mountain, and things could kind of fall apart really quickly. And it's a little worrying when you actually dive into the way this team has been built, and it's been built fairly poorly, right? It's not been built. It's been built with the assumption that Connor McDavid is going to be the best player in the world, and he's going to elevate a lot of the issues on this roster, right? And we're just going to plug things up with whatever we can find and call it a day, and it's not going to work if Connor McDavid's not there. And I think that, if he does end up leaving and this team is kind of stuck with what they have, it's going to be a pretty rude awakening in Edmonton. And maybe maybe for Oilers fans, and this going to be tough to hear, but maybe for Oilers fans, like a Connor McDavid leaving will actually be like one of the best things to happen to this team, because they might actually finally have to wake up and turn things around, right? Because the way that this team is being built isn't like that much different than what it was pre-Connor McDavid. You just had Connor McDavid to make it better, right? To elevate the floor of the team to a massive level. And same thing on Draisaitl. But like the decisions being made up top on this team like are still the same kind of poor decisions that were being made pre-Connor McDavid, and maybe to a lesser extent, but they're still there and they're still prevalent. So I worry about, even if he does re-sign, what the true cap on this team is. Can they win a Stanley Cup? Absolutely. They were a game away from it 2 years ago. They were 2 games away from it last year. They very much can win a Stanley Cup, but it's not because the team has been very insanely built. It's because 97 and 29 are on the roster. We'll end here with Brent Kulak, and Kulak I enjoy as a player. I think that his expected numbers offensively are a lot better than his actual production, but defensively he's a very sound defender, especially for a guy who's bottom-ish of the lineup guy. He's always been very reliable. He was super reliable in Montreal too. Excellent career guy, somebody who I've been a huge fan of for a very long time. But as we talked about with a bunch of these guys, he's 31 currently, going to be 32 by the end of the season. There's not a lot of runway left there too. And for a guy who's already, a third pair defenseman, kind of just low event-ish player, I don't know how long that runway is for him. But again, I like Brent Kulak. I think that he's a very solid player. Going into the season, I think as your fifth defenseman, it's one of the best number 5 guys in the NHL still. So I like Kulak in that sense, but I do think there's legitimate questions about what the long term fit is there, and you're very much just playing year by year in Edmonton right now, and I like Brett Kulak. I think that he's very good for that role, and he should have a solid season again, just being a very good low event. Throw him over the boards. He can kind of be your shutdown guy. The similar role that he's playing, in Montreal before and now in Edmonton. I think he's been very good at that. Let's talk about the goalies here, because the goalies are fascinating, right? Like, here's the thing. If the Edmonton Oilers didn't have Stuart Skinner, like, let's say in a fictional world, Calvin Pickard is the starter right now. Stuart Skinner is a guy that they would want to trade for and feel very good about, right? Let's say Stuart Skinner didn't exist. The Edmonton Oilers still go on the runs they did. Calvin Pickard played a couple games, in the Stanley Cup Finals, and looked solid. He played a bunch in the both playoffs, both years. If we went into this summer, Calvin Pickard was the starter, right? Same thing happens, but instead of Stuart Skinner playing half the games in the last 2 playoffs, it's just Calvin Pickard being the guy. And they traded for Stuart Skinner this summer. You know what the narrative around Edmonton would be? Oh my God, they fixed their goaltending. They have a competent starting goalie now. That's what they needed. They're going to win the cup. That would be the narrative, right? And then it's not far away from where we were, because Calvin Pickard played significant time in both playoff runs the last 2 seasons, right? So like this world that I'm creating right now is not that far from reality. And I think that's important to note here, because Stuart Skinner isn't a great goalie, but he is a starting goalie. And there's some teams out there that we've talked about who would be very happy with Stuart Skinner as their starting goalie, because it's better than what they had, right? Because it's better than what they are currently running. And I think that the issue here is that, I don't know how much better the Oilers would have been if the answer was John Gibson. And we're going to find out, because, Detroit is I guess, closer to a playoff spot than Anaheim is. I think that's an interesting discussion to have another day. And sure, playing on a Stanley Cup contending team might be more motivating for John Gibson, whatever. But I don't think Stuart Skinner is like a bad... Like, I think you can win with Stuart Skinner. Right? Like, is Stuart Skinner that much worse than Adin Hill was the year that he came out of being a third-string goalie and won a Stanley Cup in Vegas? My answer to that is no. Right? The problem is the team built in front of him, right? You look at Vegas's roster, and it's significantly better than what Edmonton has top to bottom, right? The year the Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup. And I think that's kind of the problem here, is that Stuart Skinner has been somewhat unfairly been blamed for how poorly this Oilers team, especially up front, is built behind McDavid and Draisaitl. Now, would the Edmonton Oilers having UC Saros make them a more legitimate Stanley Cup contender than now? If the Edmonton Oilers had traded for UC Saros this summer and he was their starter, Calvin Pickard was the backup, would the Oilers still be sixth on this list? No, they'd be probably like 2 or 3, right, at the worst. Fair, right? At worst, they'd be 3. But, like, I really, when I look at this team, yes, they were 24th in goaltending. Again, like, the gap between the Oilers and the team in, like, 14th is extremely small. Goalies are weird. Like, there's micro... Like, I could have just had everybody tied for 14th. Like, half the league would have been tied for 14th at that point. Like, I don't think that would have been very interesting to go through as a series. But I really don't think the goaltending is the issue here. I really don't believe, like, when I look at Stuart Skinner's numbers, that I'm looking at a guy who can't be a goalie that wins a Stanley Cup, because Adin Hill won a Stanley Cup. Jordan Binnington, coming out of being a backup in the American League at the beginning of the season, went on to win a Stanley Cup. The difference is that both those teams had a more complete roster than the Edmonton Oilers. Granted, neither of those teams had Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, but they both had teams where all 4 lines on the ice were very, very good and could be competitive, right? Like, if you're like, you need to have the proper depth in order to win in the NHL. I don't think you need to have a top 5 goalie to win, and teams have proven that. Hell, 3 years ago, when the Florida Panthers went to their first of 3 Stanley Cup finals, Sergei Bobrovsky was the 3rd-string goalie going into the playoffs that year. Right? Like, he had an awful regular season. He was not the starter. He wasn't the backup. Right? It was an injury and, a poor performance that led to him finally having to get thrown in, down against the Bruins, and they came back, and the rest of the history. Let's not forget about that. Right, like, the last 2 years, Andrei Vasilevsky has been just as bad as Connor Hellebuyck has been in the playoffs. The difference is Andrei Vasilevsky has 2 Stanley Cup rings, so nobody cares. I don't think Stuart Skinner's the problem. I think that the fundamental way that this team has been built around McDavid and Draisaitl is the problem. I truly believe that. And I think Stuart Skinner has been the scapegoat for that. Now, if the Oilers would have traded for UC Saros, is this team better? If the Oilers had Elias Sorokin, is this team better? Yeah, of course they would be. But I don't think it's necessary. I think what is necessary is taking a good look in the mirror and saying, man, this team is not built optimally to win a Stanley Cup. Right? If the Oilers would have won a Stanley Cup over the last 2 years, it would have been despite themselves. Which has happened before. There's been teams who have won despite themselves. It's rare. And I think if I'm Connor McDavid and I'm looking at this team, I really, really hope that that is the message that he is sending to this front office, is that we are not optimally built. It's not just, let's go get a goaltender and all the problems go away. It is the way this team has been functionally put together is inoptimal to succeed in the NHL this year and beyond. It is only somewhat working and it's somewhat competent because they have Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, and obviously the guys like Evan Bouchard and Zach Hyman and Matthias Ekholm, and the guys that I've highlighted as being good. I'm not saying it's just 2 players, but you get my point, right? Like, there's a bit of nuance to what I'm saying here. So yeah, like, Stuart Skinner isn't great, but he's a starting goalie in the NHL, and he's on par with what Jordan Binnington was his first year, and he's on par with what Adin Hill was when he won a Stanley Cup. And that's good enough. Like, that is absolutely good enough. He's on par with what Antti Niemi was when Antti Niemi won a Stanley Cup in Chicago, right? But all those teams were built far better than what the Edmonton Oilers are, top to bottom. Like, from a fundamental, philosophical level, those teams were built better. And that's the issue. So I'll leave it with this, with the power play. Obviously, the power play is so good, right? Like, Draisaitl, McDavid, Hyman, Evan Bouchard, and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is a phenomenal power play, right? Like, they're all in the A categories. The worst of them is Evan Bouchard and Zach Hyman, which is like, those would be the best guys on half the power plays in the league. This is where Ryan Nugent-Hopkins makes his money on this team. The second unit isn't very good, but it doesn't have to be, because if the second unit comes on, then you're probably not scoring anyway. The penalty kill is where I have some concerns. It was a poor penalty kill last year. I don't think they really did anything to improve it, so you're just going to have to kind of hope for the best in that sense. But yeah, I mean, I think that the rant that I had during the goalie section is kind of going to sum up my thoughts on the Oilers, and I really hope that, for the sake of the team, that McDavid continues to put pressure on them, right? And if he does re-sign in Edmonton, it's on a short deal. And that will put pressure on the Oilers to continue to try to be better, because their fans deserve a better team, right? Like, I'm not saying this because, like, I hate the Oilers. Like, I like the Oilers. I wanted them to win the Stanley Cup last year. I love Connor McDavid. He's one of my favorite players in the NHL. But I want them to be better. I want every team in the league to be better. I want every team to be smarter, to build smarter, to innovate. And Edmonton's just not doing that. They've become stagnant because they have 97. And hopefully the fear of not having 97 is what sparks this team to finally be great. Because we could be looking at, we are so close, the Edmonton Oilers being the dynasty of the NHL. Right? We were 3 wins away from it. Right? Like, 3 games go different, and the Edmonton Oilers have back-to-back Stanley Cups. And that is with this inoptimal team. Like, if the Oilers could build a coherent roster, man, like, they'd be unstoppable. So that's all I got for you. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked the video, leave a like. Make sure to comment down below what you think of the Edmonton Oilers, and we'll see you for the next video. Thanks for watching, and we're into the top 5 now. These are truly like my cream of the crop teams at this point. Yeah, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.